front of you or do it in front of the whole class. Everyone's gonna be the first option. I was like, oh shoot. I was like, oh, maybe you guys do. Perfect.
Yeah.
I have to sing it this week.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Chico Hot Springs, but it says something else.
Which one?
The Chico Hot Springs one.
Oh yeah.
Something, but it's like it says like something else in Colorado.
So where are Brianna and Fiona? It says excused absent here already. Are they on a field trip or something?
She's
Maybe
coming.
their
Her
mom
mom called in and was like, Brianna's sick. She's not coming.
When the parent is on top of it.
Whoa.
Okay. All right. So today's goal is to try to clarify the dramatic lives of the Tudor dynasty as much as possible. And it is how many in here lack the self-respect enough to admit that you have watched that horrible miniseries called The Tudors?
Oh, I watched part of it. I haven't watched all of it.
No idea what you're talking about.
Do you mean on the one on Netflix?
Yes.
Yeah, I've watched like the first like 2 seasons. It's not very good.
It's not.
It's really
that
intense.
good.
It's not. It's like not entertainment, but it's also not a documentary.
No, it's
That's
nowhere
the problem.
gratuitous sex scenes.
Yeah,
Awesome.
basically.
That's what it is. All right.
Every time
you mind this.
So I wonder, while I get going here, if I could have a volunteer.
You're like,
I'll volunteer somebody. Use your family tree that you made, okay?
yes.
Sophie's
Yes.
is first.
Sophie's.
And see if you can recount for us the Tudor dynasty, like first, second, etc. Where did the throne go through the Tudor dynasty?
Yes,
Do you want
literally.
me to
Oh, do whatever you need to do. You're just gonna.
Okay,
Holy shizness.
I was stuck at my parents' office because there was no Wi-Fi at my house, on top of it not being Wi-Fi here. So the supplies that I had available to me were medical supplies. So this is made with tongue depressors and Band-Aids and stickers. So
And wait,
enjoy. And whatever this
Better
paper is that goes on
artistic
the table.
tools to make a
Oh,
change.
yeah.
Okay, wait. I don't think I have to unwrap the whole thing. I think it's like right
What
here.
about like a fig?
Oh my
Figs.
goodness.
Somebody in my freshman class yesterday had
I think
figs and
that's
they
fine.
left them and I had figs.
Okay.
I'd go for a
Fig?
fig.
Yeah, I'm full
Fig
of
anyone?
stuff.
yeah, do you need to unfold or is this like a different?
Do you want to just like wait? Do you want?
I think it's still
Do
recording.
you want to
That's
magnet
for
it to
$8.
the?
We're eating
They actually don't
It
have
might be easier for
Yeah, for
magnet.
Or
Because it might be a little hard.
How do I do this?
I can help tape if someone else wants to like.
Oh, I got
Take some of those.
I was gonna take those pictures.
I was worried kind of thing here. Stick in.
I'm not I'm scared of it.
Here we hold it like this.
As long as it's not silly.
How do you eat this?
I kept looking at these slides.
So.
All right.
Oh. Oh. I don't like that.
Wait, what about the last part?
Wow.
Fig.
What last part?
The last part.
Oh, that's
It's
in
not.
France and the Habsburgs.
Oh.
So I'm gonna not worry about that.
Okay.
So we have the Princess of York, who was the daughter of that peasant woman, and Henry,
Wow.
one of the Henrys. Yeah, I think. And then she married this guy who's like a very obscure relative, and they started the Tudor line. And he was the first. He was Henry VII, and he was a Tudor. And then they had two. Well, they might have had more kids, but they had two important kids, and that's Margaret of England and Henry VIII.
Oh my
Who was
goodness.
the one with all the wives. So he married first Catherine of Aragon, who's the, wait, she's not. These should be switched. She's the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, I think. And then, and they had Mary I of England, who was Bloody Mary. And then he divorced her, and then married Anne Boleyn. They had Elizabeth I, who's a really famous Elizabeth. He beheaded her. Then he married Jane Seymour, who's also English, and they had Edward the Sixth, who was the first to take the throne of the three kids, and then died because he was like sickly and stuff. And then she died of natural causes after childbirth. Then he married Anne of Cleves, he divorced her, married Catherine Howard, beheaded her, and then married Catherine Parr and then died, and she outlived him. And then on the other side, we have Margaret of England, Henry VIII's sister, who married James IV of Scotland, and they had James V, shockingly, who married Mary Louise. Then they had Mary Queen of Scots, who had a bunch of different husbands, including the King of France at one point, briefly, for like a year, until he died. And then the important one is Henry Stuart, who, and the two of them had James. And so once these guys, the kids of Henry VIII, died off and didn't have any kids, the next in line to the throne would then be James the First of England, or James the Sixth of Scotland, because of the, great-parents, grandparents, because of his great-great-grandparents. And then he was the king of both of the countries.
Get all that?
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's actually pretty well summarized, but we're going to go through a lot of it today. Now, all you have to do today is follow along, and if you want to use these timelines, these family tree things that you have made, except for August, who doesn't have enough in the throne. August!
I don't know how it's
Well, you can supplement what you put on your timeline. So this is one of those places in the curriculum of European history where it's just this mad, crazy story, and it connects with every other story of every other royal family tree at some point or other. So we're just going to kind of narrate it and see how far we can get. We won't get all the way through. So I'm going to have to sit because I have to be plugged in, unfortunately. But I'll refer to the family tree. That's the best way to go about this. So here is the grand arc of the Tudor dynasty, the short version. It starts with Henry VII. Henry VII leaves the throne to his son, Henry VIII. Henry VIII is the last king of England named Henry to this point, and for the foreseeable future. He kind of broke the mold on Henrys. They didn't want to do any more Henrys after him because of him. Henry VIII, when he dies, he has 3 children. The throne goes to all 3 of them in turn. First, it goes to the youngest of his children because of gender, his son, Edward. Edward, however, dies at the age of 15, and before he has any children of his own. Now, briefly, there's this 9-day stint, which for political reasons, upon the death of Edward, the throne goes to a very distant cousin whose picture is not even here on the map, whose name is, she is here, Lady Jane Grey. She's queen for 9 days after Edward here. Edward, for reasons you will understand if you don't yet, makes a deathbed move to cut his 2 older sisters out of the line of succession. But doesn't work. Tries to leave it to his distant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, but she ends up being toppled after 9 days by her distant cousin, Edward's sister Mary, whom history knows as Bloody Mary. And Mary carries on for 5 years as queen, but she ends up having no children of her own and has to leave the throne to her much despised younger sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth then sits on the throne for 45 years, during which time she does not marry and purportedly has no children. There are some conspiracy theories that she did end up having a secret love child, but we have no way to verify that.
Why was she so hated?
Why was Mary so hated? Or why? Elizabeth was hated by her sister Mary because of they had different mothers, and their father ditched Mary's mother to be with Elizabeth's mother in a very ungentlemanly way. And in addition, there was religion. So, Elizabeth sits on the throne for 45 years. She does not marry. She produces no heir to the throne. And so, when she dies, there are no more Tudors. That is the end of the dynasty. And the throne goes to her distant cousin, James, the King of Scotland, who is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Elizabeth's chief rival in life, but predeceased her, mostly because Elizabeth had her head chopped off. And then thus begins the next royal dynasty in England, the Stuart family tree. So the Tudors are Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward, briefly Lady Jane Grey, Mary, Elizabeth. And they last from 1485 to 1603, so a little bit more than 100 years. Basically, the whole Protestant Reformation period and Renaissance period is the Tudor dynasty in England. So really important stuff happens. Not the least of which is one of these Tudors breaks England away from the Catholic Church, and England has remained broken from the Catholic Church ever since. Which one was that?
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII. Okay. Anybody want me to explain anything further before we kind of get back into the weeds and the nitty-gritty? Taylor.
Why did Elizabeth take the throne? Did Mary die?
Mary died.
Okay.
Yep.
Isn't it kind of hard for a woman to conceal a secret love child?
Well, yes, particularly at that age, unless the woman is the last of her dynasty and all of the woman's supporters, and unless she has not named an heir to the throne at all, and
Start the recording.
if having an illegitimate love child would ruin her queenship and subject her to possibly being like overthrown, then she might have a whole conspiracy of supporters who could say that she had this illness called dropsy that caused a swollen abdomen for 9 months and caused her to go into seclusion and suddenly emerge, which did happen.
That's very suspicious.
So,
9 months.
all right. So when we last met, I was kind of talking up not the Tudor family tree, but the previous royal family, the Plantagenets. Yes, and because that's how we get to the Tudors, from the Plantagenets. So here are the Plantagenets. There's the early Plantagenets, and we need to focus on the later Plantagenets. So who remembers the saga of King Edward marrying the peasant woman Elizabeth Woodville, and then having 3 children and the overthrow and all that?
Yeah.
Sarah, what do you remember?
So they had 3 children, and the first one
Is this one?
right, but she was a girl. So
She's
they
a
were,
girl.
So they were like, she's the younger brother. So they were like, sorry, Elizabeth, York. And so her brother, they're both like really young, and he became the ruler, the monarch. But then there was like a regent because he was so young, he wasn't of age, and so
Who would the regent have been?
his uncle,
Mm.
mother.
But what happened
Which-
before his mother could actually become the regent?
He was kidnapped.
No,
Yeah.
Yeah. Her
Richard was like, no, I want the throne.
uncle kidnapped. So he
The
put him in the
uncle,
tower.
yeah.
And did he, this is a leading question, did he have other supporters who
Yeah.
wanted him to take
The
it?
nobles, the nobles didn't like Edward because they were like, a son of a peasant woman can't rule over us. Like, that's
Yes.
the justice. We need justice. And then they were like, Richard III.
That
He's
was really
still-
Italian for but whatever.
He was like still of like royal bloodline. So they were like, okay, like he's the obvious choice. So they like help him kidnap the little
The 2
princes
princes down here.
and take them, and they're like locked in a tower and then killed. And then he finds Elizabeth, and they're like at like a church, like a monastery. Where are they? They're at like
In
a
in
sanctuary.
Westminster Abbey. Yes,
Yeah,
which is right in
Westminster
London.
Abbey. And they find them, and they're just like kind of held hostage there. And then
Yeah.
Richard basically just like takes the throne. He like makes himself. He like self-appoints himself.
And his supporters, line
They're like,
up
yay.
and fall in line with that. So he's on the throne for 2.5 years.
Good job.
And in the meantime, young Elizabeth here, actually the throne, with the death of her brothers, here's the way the throne is supposed to pass on. It's called, and this is in England, doesn't work the same way in France, which is important. It's called primogeniture. And primogeniture says that if the king dies, then the king's oldest son gets the throne. So it goes directly from father to son, and if the oldest son dies, then it goes to the next oldest son and the next oldest son, or in birth order, etc. If the king has no sons, then it goes to female children. So oldest daughter, next oldest daughter, etc. And if the king has no surviving children at all, you have to go back up the family tree to the king's father and find the king's father's next oldest son. So in other words, the dead king's immediately younger brother. So it goes down before it goes over. Does that make sense? Okay. So even if it has to go down to a woman, it's supposed to go down before it goes over. So really, Elizabeth here had a much stronger claim to the throne than Richard did, but she was a woman and didn't have the supporters to enforce that. I should note that it was only a handful of years ago, I'm going to say 4 years ago, that Parliament in England changed this rule. And so, beginning with the children of William and Kate Middleton, beginning with their children, the throne will go to the king, the monarch's oldest child, regardless of gender. So, still birth order, gender no longer a factor.
They had a boy first.
But they had a boy first. So,
But it's a boy
it will be little King George. It will be King George VII if he comes to the throne. So, but I digress. So, during this period, Elizabeth actually entered into sort of secret flirtation marriage negotiations with her uncle.
Oh yes.
I don't know what's this.
Because they thought that this would just it seemed like, what's the alternative? A civil war between the forces of Elizabeth and the forces of Richard? That does nobody any good. So he sort of like made creepy, disgusting overtures to her, and she was sort of like, but
Alright.
Nothing ever came of that because at the same time, mind you, there's this whole other side of the family. Now, the House of Lancaster had, in previous generations, had some of its descendants sitting on the throne, but it had almost all died out. There was, however, one very distant male, sort of the scion, the heir of the House of Lancaster, and it was this man named Henry Tudor. And his father was a guy named Edmund Tudor, who was actually the valet of a royal servant way back here, but he had royal blood. So Henry Tudor, as the last surviving member of the House of Lancaster, when all of this stuff happened on the other side with King Edward dying and then Richard III usurping the throne, are we familiar with that word, usurp? He fled. He fled to France and stayed there in exile because he wasn't safe. But he had a very important ally back at home plotting on his behalf. Who do you suppose that person might have been? What person over on this side might have really wanted Henry here to become the king? Well, his dad had died. His mother. Now this lady here, Lady Margaret Beaufort. She, it doesn't show on the family tree, she also had a claim to the throne of her own. And I don't know if any of you are really observant and looking at dates, but what is the date of the year of birth of Lady Margaret Beaufort? What is the year of birth of Henry here?
Oh no. Oh no. That's not.
She was 13 and a half.
Oh.
That's worse than 13.
She was 13 and a half when her son was born, and the birth of the child nearly killed her, and she wasn't ever able to have any more children. She was 13 and a half, and this was a time and a half.
The half is very important.
See, that's something a 13-year-old would say. Which means
Right?
they shouldn't be having babies.
That was right. But she did, and somehow she survived, but she was not able to have children after that. And all of her ambitions were caught up in her son Henry being the king. And she was connected to other families, and she was really conniving and really smart. So she sent her son Henry away to France to protect him, and then she connived with other families to try to bring him to the throne. Now guess who she was conniving with. Find another woman or two on this family tree that you can see that she would have been secretly conniving with.
Elizabeth and
Elizabeth.
This Elizabeth and this Elizabeth. She was conniving. Now, imagine how this Elizabeth felt. Her husband has died. Her 2 sons have been murdered. She is really in danger, and she's a peasant woman. So she doesn't have family connections. She felt incredibly threatened. She briefly entertained the idea of having her oldest daughter, Elizabeth, marry her uncle just for everyone's safety. But at the same time, she was secretly talking with a what's-her-face over here, Margaret, about we should get our kids together, we should overthrow Richard the usurper. Well, eventually, that's what they did. So, Henry here, Henry Tudor, with his mother's help and with the help of Elizabeth Woodville, gets a small army from the French king. He makes a landing in Wales, which is where his family is from, his father's family. And some of the local Welsh nobles rally to his side, and there's a big battle. The battle is at a place called Bosworth Field. And Henry Tudor, in front of his army, meets the king, Richard, in front of his army, and they have this big battle. And nobles on both sides line up. And in particular, there's this one noble who is the Earl of Warwick, who happens to be the second husband of Lady Margaret Beaufort over here, sits on the sidelines for a while and waits to see which way the battle will go. And at a certain point, he decides to throw his weight in behind his stepson, Henry VII, and tilts the battle in Henry VII's favor. And Richard is killed in the battle, and his body is horrifically abused, like stripped naked, beaten, cut, lashed, dragged behind horses through the roads, and eventually buried unceremoniously in a tiny little churchyard out in western England. And recently, I'm going to say 5 or 6 years ago, his body was found. They never knew actually what happened to it because it was buried in an unmarked grave. But somebody out there was doing a parking lot for a new, grocery store. Not even kidding. And in digging up the earth, they found his grave. And it was marked, and then they did DNA testing on the skeleton, and lo and behold, it was actually Richard III.
That's crazy.
So, and there had been a big debate historically before that because Richard III had been cast as a villain by the people who came after him, who were his enemies, right? And they had always said that not only was he an evil king who deserved to be overthrown, but he had the mark of the devil on him in that he had a curved spine. He was a hunchback. And everybody wondered, well, was that really true or not? Well, it turns out it was true. He had horrible scoliosis, and he had kind of a deformed left arm. So, that's the fall of the House of Plantagenet. Why is this important for the Tudors? Well, it's important for 2 big reasons. Henry VII here comes to the throne, and one of the first things he does upon coming to the throne is marry this woman, Elizabeth of York. Which of the 2 of them has a stronger claim to the throne by blood? I'm not hearing anybody saying anything.
What?
She does. She's
Which of them has a stronger blood claim to the throne?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth does by far. Sorry, I didn't.
He's been saying it constantly for the past minute.
Put my hearing aids in. She has a much stronger blood claim to the throne, but here's something Henry does really strangely. He wins the battle where he overthrows Richard, and he immediately has himself proclaimed the king and anointed as the king before he marries Elizabeth. Okay? Which means he didn't. Why would he not want to wait until he marries her to have himself proclaimed the king?
Because she can become queen, or like become queen who has power.
He doesn't want to say that it's through his wife that he is gaining the throne. He is asserting his own right to the throne.
Right, how would he do that if he didn't have any claim?
Well,
He did
that's
have,
a
like,
great
some,
question.
but, like,
So
less, yeah.
he
Less.
does have a blood claim. It's not as strong as hers. But believe it or not, in the law, and this is still true, there is another way that you can claim the throne in England. There is a way to claim the throne of England that is not by blood. It is by conquest. By conquest. He claims the throne by right of conquest. Now that is really, why is that a weaker claim than a blood claim? What does it say about what can happen to you someday? Somebody can do this to you too. This is a huge part of the whole Tudor dynasty. The fact that it starts with a claim of conquest. It drives stuff that the Tudors do all the way through the next generations because they have a weak claim to the throne. And they're constantly worried somebody else will assert the claim of conquest and overthrow them.
Now, doesn't he have a really strong claim because it's Elizabeth plus him, so their children would have like a double
Yeah.
claim?
It makes it stronger, for sure. Yes.
Would he be considered a usurper like Richard was?
Well, that all depends. Some said yes. Enough said no that it didn't matter. Now here's another really interesting thing that he did, and I want to see if you can tell me why. The Battle of Bosworth Field, in which Richard was overthrown, happened on a certain day. I can't remember the day, but it doesn't matter. Henry, in writing up the document that gets himself proclaimed an anointed king, backdates the anointing to 2 days before the battle. It's not when it actually happened, but he changed history in the official record to have himself proclaimed king 2 days before he actually overthrew Richard on the battlefield. Why would he have done that?
To look like it's not, like he didn't get it through conquest.
You're on the right track. What would it mean for anybody who... Remember how I said his father-in-law was sitting on the battlefield, like, waiting to see which side to come in on?
Oh, it made it seem like his uncles. I mean, his stepfather was the reason why.
What does that mean for anybody who was against him in that battle? They were actually, we've like backdated all this, but it means they were actually traitors. So now he can punish them. So,
Just like basically sets up shop or throwing.
so he does these like really
Like,
kind of
not
shady,
actually true,
shiesty
Aaron.
things to
Yeah,
buttress
backdates it.
his claim to the throne. He has himself proclaimed king before he marries Elizabeth, whose claim is stronger than his. He actually backdates the battle to a date when it didn't actually happen, so that all of his enemies who fought against him and have now lost are traitors to the throne. And that story will go on. So he marries Elizabeth, right? And she marries him, and actually, you know what? Turns out they were a really good couple. Like, they really, they were a love match. It wasn't planned that way. It was a marriage of convenience at first, but it turns out it was a love match. They really had a lot of affection for each other. And unlike many kings, there is absolutely no evidence that he was ever unfaithful to her. Go ahead. So then,
You're so good people.
Well,
Then
they're not
comes
actually still around.
the next chapter.
I mean, she couldn't stuck with her creepy uncles.
Okay.
It's an upgrade.
So, Henry has married Elizabeth. There are literally no male children at all, or female children for that matter, on either side of the House of York or the House of Lancaster. It's down to Henry and Elizabeth. They are the ends. What would happen if they both died? It would be
end.
chaos. People with like really distant claims would like claim the throne. There would be civil war. England's already coming off almost a whole century of civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster. We're talking about the Tudors.
Oh, happy
days.
You want to join?
A bit brutal.
Or are you just
I'm
heading-
just heading downstairs to sort my stuff out, so I was just going to say cheerio. We'll see you in Scotland.
Yes, you will.
Yeah, we'll climb some mountains.
You will.
Have fun.
Thanks for everything.
Thank you. Have a good class. Enjoy the Tudors. They were quite, probably misunderstood, but they were quite brutal.
They were pretty brutal.
They were. Not a lot of love going on then.
Thankfully, we have them to talk about now.
Yeah.
Gives me a job.
Well, it does. It absolutely does. Yeah. And they kind of Game of Thrones gets based on things like that.
Yeah,
So,
it does.
Okay, see you later.
Bye, Jen. Okay.
Can you do her accent for us while you're
No, when we get to the Scotland part.
Yes, I'll attempt. I'll attempt.
No, you have to do a British accent right now, right?
Well, you know, if I were being authentic, I would be doing like medieval Welsh because Henry the Tudor was from Wales, and I have no idea what that would have sounded
I
like.
think you should try.
I have to be inspired. I have to feel it. So when we get there. Oh, you know what else I need to put out? This symbol of the Tudor family, the Tudor rose. What do you notice about it? Yes?
It's a combination of the roses of York and Lancaster.
Yes. If I were to go back to our friends the Plantagenets and the two houses, the House of Lancaster, they called them the Wars of the Roses because they had different insignias. So the House of Lancaster was the red rose. The House of York was the white rose. And in the House of Tudor, they purposefully, Henry, I should say, purposefully blended them together to make the Tudor
Kinda
rose.
nice.
It was the symbol that the wars of the roses are over, and now it's this new
Kind of cute, that.
rose, red and white, bullseye. All right. Henry and Elizabeth are the last of their lines. What do they need to get cracking on?
Kids.
Babies.
So
Kids.
many children.
Plus, it will solidify their dynasty. You should be aware that in the wings, there are nobles on both sides with distant claims to the throne, sharpening their knives, waiting for this to fall apart, waiting for their chance. So, they need children. So they get busy right away. Now, take a look here at the next generation. You can see that, well, this is actually mostly Henry VIII and his wives. Let me try to point out the children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Okay. Maybe if I do a different family tree, actually, it will show them that
Kind of the good one.
Yeah, that's what I think.
No,
That's
the
the
same
exact
one.
same one.
that's not what we want. Hold on.
That's the go-to one.
Just click the first one that pops up. There you go.
I don't know the difference.
That's worse.
Oh gosh, Wikipedia.
That's not
Seemed like a good couple.
We went back to that.
A devil?
A devil.
Straight
child.
Satan.
That's not helping.
If you hit the two
There's no view.
There's no view image.
It looks like an egg. That's what I drew. It looks like an apple. What was it?
All right, this one will work.
It's an egg.
There's no pictures. Especially just
No, but
so much easier to visualize a picture.
Also, I can't read it.
we'll go back to the other one. All right, so look, I don't know how well you can see that, if at all.
Oh,
that's
that's
much
much better.
Okay, so here's Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. They have 4 children, really. They have 5, but one of them dies really young. So this all becomes incredibly important for stuff that happens decades later. It isn't just like fluff. So the first child is a boy named Arthur. Yay, they have a boy first. That was like huge big deal when, and you'll notice Henry becomes king in 1485. Arthur's born in 1486. They got cracking right away on this childbearing thing. So first they have a boy, then 3 years later they have a girl called Margaret. Then, a number of years after that, well, 2 years later, they have another boy named Henry. And then, a year after that, they have another little girl, whom they call Elizabeth, after her mother. And then, 4 years after that, they have another little girl called Mary.
Which one of them dies?
Oh, it's Elizabeth.
Well, Elizabeth here dies
yeah.
when she's only 3.
Oh.
And I forget what it is. It's like a childhood illness.
Oh.
Which was not uncommon back then. Okay, so the story only gets more interesting from here. Who is going to be the next king according to the rules of primogeniture? Arthur. Now, there is a reason why they gave him the name Arthur, by the way. It's because King Arthur of the Arthurian legend was this like historical figure that united Britain to like lead it into this glorious golden age. Plus, he was also from Wales, so they called him Arthur because of like the Welsh lineage of the Tudor dynasty, and he will be the modern, to them modern anyway, incarnation of Arthur, and it will be grand and glorious, and all will be well. So, he's the big time heir. Now they have this second son, Henry, yes? When royal or noble families had more than one son, the tradition was, oldest son becomes the heir to the family title. Second son has a different career planned out, which would be what?
Prince of Wales.
The church. The church. So the plan was, as the second son, young Henry would be a churchman. He would become a cardinal or a bishop or something like that. Not a bad gig at a time when churchmen didn't follow a very churchy life and they just got really rich and powerful. So that was the plan. Now, in order to enhance the family's prestige and power and security, they needed right away to arrange a marriage for young Arthur. Now, he is the crown prince. So what kind of person should he marry?
A princess.
He should marry a princess. Hopefully from another country that can be an ally and help England be secure on the international stage. Now you know and I know that at this point in history, which other country on the map of Europe is the arch enemy of England? It's France, and it will remain so until like 18-something. And France was extremely powerful then. It had just defeated England in the 100 Years' War. It had taken all of England's continental possessions except for one little outpost in Calais. So, what brand new country on the map that has massive wealth and new world colonies and all kinds of prestige? Spain. Spain, ruled by Ferdinand and Isabella, is like the new kid on the block. And guess what? Both Spain and England have fears about France. So it seemed natural for an alliance between England and Spain with the objective of keeping both safe from France. And it just so happened that the King and Queen of Spain had a marriageable daughter. They actually had two marriageable daughters. Now the oldest marriageable daughter, whose name was Juana, she's already spoken for. Who's she betrothed to that we've talked about already? The Holy Roman Emperor. And it will be she who, with the Holy Roman Emperor, has a little boy named Charles, who becomes Charles V, and becomes the next Holy Roman Emperor, super duper monarch. But they have a second daughter as well, and this second daughter's name is Catherine. So, Henry and Elizabeth enter into very fervent marriage negotiations with Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and they arrange for their two children to be married. Arthur will marry Catherine, the Princess of Spain. Now, then maybe now I can go back to the other family tree. I'll keep them both going here, just because this other one has pictures. Okay, so this family tree does show with these two dotted lines that mean marriage. Here's Arthur, and by the way, that is a pretty good simile of what he looked like.
The girl?
That's the boy. And here is Catherine. Now, when you think of a Spanish woman, you might think of a certain kind of a look. That is a stereotype that is not necessarily true. In fact, Catherine was a ginger. She had very light skin that burned easily and blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. So, Catherine and Arthur married. Now, if you look at the dates, which one of them is a little bit older? Catherine's a little bit older. Which one of them is going to more likely become the king of a country, or the ruler of a country? Arthur. So the arrangement was she would come to England and live there. So at the age of 17, Catherine is packed in a boat with some of her servants, and she never ever sees her parents again. She goes to England, where she marries Arthur, who is 15. She's like just turned 17. He's at the tail end of being 15. And she's greeted warmly, and like everybody loves her. She's pretty, she's smart, she's nice. And she and Arthur get married. And then they go off for their honeymoon to Wales. Why Wales, you say? Well, because ever since the medieval period, the crown prince of England has been called the Prince of Wales, which means actually he ruled Wales. And there was a special castle in Wales where, and there still is, that is the court of the Prince of Wales. So they go off to Wales for their honeymoon, and then tragedy strikes. After about 2 months. In some stories, it's like 3 days, but no, it was actually like 2 months that they were married. Arthur gets dreadfully ill with an illness there was an epidemic of, we don't know what the illness was. They called it the sweating sickness. And it was an onset, like really rapidly, of an extremely high fever and a terrible cough and shakes and delirium and death. So, to me, it sounds something like meningitis, maybe something like that, but it was going around. Well, anyway, Arthur caught it, and he dies. Arthur never had a very strong constitution anyway. He was always kind of a sickly kid. So, anyway, he's dead after 2 months. Poor Catherine's there in Wales. Doesn't speak any English. She has some of her, like, nannies and ladies in waiting and stuff with her, but that's it. She's got a dead husband. But now what is to become of the alliance between England and Spain? Everybody still wants that alliance. Well, here's what happens. Arthur's dead, so if we go back to this family tree, who is next in line? Henry is. Well, Henry's 10.
Oh.
And he's in religion school.
He's already a deaf child.
It's okay. They just pull him out of religion school and they put him in king school, so to speak. And he is the next in line. So, okay, it's all good. It's not like there's no other prince, there's no other heir. They have another one waiting in line. Now here's where the story gets actually really kind of tragic. Because Elizabeth of York, up here, the year in which Arthur dies is 1502, and Elizabeth of York, Henry VII is devastated when Arthur dies. Like really just completely devastated, as a parent would be. Right, August?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth of York went to her husband, and she really comforted him, and she said, you know what? It's okay. I know it's awful. We have another son, and
First, you don't succeed. Try.
And we're both still young, and we can have more children. Now, if you look here, in 1503, she was how old? She was 37.
Oh.
So she was not old, and she could have another child. And guess what? Immediately, she did get pregnant again after Arthur's death. And then she carried that pregnancy all the way to term. And then she had a horrible childbirth, and she and the child both died.
Oh.
Poor Henry VII.
Yeah.
And he was left.
A year later.
And after she died, and you have to remember,
Okay,
he really loved
I'll have another kid when he dies.
Yeah.
He was completely devastated. And he spent the last 5 years of his reign basically in isolation, locked up, depressed. His mother was still alive, Lady Margaret Beaufort. She tried to comfort him, help him, but he ends up sort of wasting away and getting really sick and stressed out, and he dies of a stroke or something like that in 1509. But anyway, young Henry is now the crown prince. What can I say about Henry as a kid? Well, let's look at the pictures. Not that picture. let's look at young Henry VIII. There he is as a prince.
Do people actually look like that? Or is it just
Yeah.
Why do they not have chins? None of them have chins.
No, he has actually a rather pronounced chin. It's just the way he's
Why?
holding it. Here's another.
What? Yeah.
That's a really
No one
famous
was
portrait of him.
Because they're all inbred.
Yeah. no,
When
it's
he was
so
young,
inaccurate.
his older brother was sickly and kind of frail. Henry was not sickly or frail. Henry, it was said, was actually the spitting image of his mother's father, Edward IV. Now, Edward IV is, well, I don't have a picture of him again. Edward,
Go back up to the other one.
I'd have to go back up to the other one.
Wait, his mother's father?
His mother's
Oh,
father,
right, okay.
Edward IV, was this really big, like, lax bro.
Oh, they
Like a football player kind of guy. He was like a big time, like he was muscle bound and brawny and like big beard and like liked to have he really liked to drink and have a good time with the bros. And Henry was like that. He wasn't frail. He was actually incredibly muscular and athletic and
Yeah.
actually, Henry here. Let's go back to young Henry. Young Henry was kind of a catch. He was like a triple threat. He was athletic, he was good looking, and he was smart. Incredible, and he was a quadruple threat. He was talented, musically and artistically talented. He composed music.
Only wasn't so crazy.
He could sing really well. He composed the music for the Christmas carol "What Child Is This?", which is Greensleeves, among a number of other things. He was apparently an incredibly talented dancer. Like that was
what
his
couldn't
thing.
you do?
And he used to,
I just want to say
well, he would dance these incredibly athletic galliards, which was like the hip hop of the day. And
Straight hip hop dancer.
he,
Just look up Gallagher.
I use so many tabs open. I've never seen
here's the
I
galliard.
don't know what you're talking about.
that. Alright, let's go.
I'm really glad this exists.
Here we go.
You fully
They're just
understand this
sitting
is
there.
Oh.
Just smell like it.
Yeah.
They're so
A little hot. Yeah, it looks like he's just floating.
So you have to imagine this with lots of like flirting and some creepy eye contact. And see, it's hip hop.
Save the last.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, yes.
It's pretty good.
Oh, let's get into the hard stuff. Oh, solo.
Yes.
How do I pick up
It's just so awkward.
Oh my god.
I love the projector screen. Where is this?
Oh.
Well,
What's going on now?
well, we're
That's
done
what
with
we
that.
wanted.
So anyway,
Exactly what I imagined it to be
he
like.
was, a lot of these galliards had like really elaborate jumps in them and lifts, and he was really proud of his calf muscles. Like he would walk up to people like, look at that, touch that. You don't have to again. Sorry. He was just really proud of his legs, as any
Like, they're misleading.
bro would be. So he was kind of a catch, and he also, even from an extremely early age, had a reputation with the girlies, and so there. That's Henry. So anyway, Henry, the deal is, let's just have Henry marry Catherine, because she's free now, and that preserves the alliance. Or is she free?
It just sounds like at the end of like a movie trailer.
Because here is the deal. she's not free because of God, because of the church. Now, to you and me in the 21st century, we would see, probably most of us, guess I'm generalizing, most of us in the room would see there is no genetic link between Henry and Catherine. They're not related, even if she married his brother. But to the church at the time, there's a line in Scripture that says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife."
Oh.
Oh, God.
And
Really specific.
in addition to that, the Catholic Church had in its canon law, it had this belief that when two people get married, their flesh becomes one flesh. And so, the moment Arthur and Catherine got married, Catherine didn't actually just become Henry's sister-in-law, she became his actual sister. Sister and sister. And so that meant that according to church law, Henry can't marry Catherine because it's incest.
Oh.
Now,
Now they're concerned about it.
And that's
Now,
never happened.
you might ask, but Elizabeth of York, Henry's mother, was almost getting ready to marry her uncle, Richard III. Well, but here's the thing about incest. You can get a waiver.
Oh.
Who can give you a waiver?
Oh.
The Pope. Why would the Pope be inclined to give some royal family a waiver?
For money.
For a favor. Waiver for favor. That's how it could work. Now, kings and popes were always in the position to do each other favors. And it was always like, you had to know, like, whatever particular pope, which royal families in Europe are they like down with and which ones are they having problems with? Well, it just so happened that the Pope at this particular time had a big problem with the royal house of France, which meant he would very much have been accommodating to England and Spain because they were against France. Does this make sense? So, in order to allow Henry to marry his brother's widow, Catherine, all they needed to do was go to the Pope, whose name was Pope Clement at the time, and say, "Your Holiness, we have a situation here. We'd love to call in a favor. We'll owe you one someday." Yes?
Okay, so if England and Spain were like making this alliance, is that why like Mary Queen of Scots was supposed to marry the
French Dauphin?
yes.
Yes. But it's even more than that at that point. Like at that point, and we'll get there at some point, Henry VIII, when Mary Queen of Scots is born, Henry VIII has sent a massive army into Scotland and defeated her father on the battlefield and is trying to capture the baby Queen of Scotland to take her back to England and make her marry his son Edward.
Oh.
The baby?
Like a
Marry the baby.
like a baby.
No, I'm
9 days old.
That's what babies get.
So,
Like, wait until the baby was old.
oh, we'll get there.
Yeah, like you
Mary
get
Queen of
married to
Scots.
the baby.
Yeah.
I feel like you
But
have these
we'll get
years
there.
of life.
So-
You're just holding it.
Yes.
Have you met
Yes.
my wife? Have you met my wife?
So, the parents, Henry VII,
How about a light hug?
Henry VII and Ferdinand and Isabella all approached the Pope, and they asked the Pope for a waiver so that Catherine can now marry her young brother-in-law, Henry. And they call it a dispensation. Not a waiver, they call it a dispensation. The Pope is happy to grant this, but he does say, okay, look, I want to do this for you, but I have to be able to give a reason that makes it seem legit. So, we have to have a formal inquiry into this. So they have a formal inquiry, and what they go back to is, church law says that when a man and a woman get married, their flesh becomes one flesh, yes? But when does the flesh unite? Well, it does not happen in the marriage ceremony. It happens in the after moments, which formally is called consummation. So, Henry VII up here basically says, we're all good. The marriage was never consummated. They got married. They immediately got in their carriage for Wales. It took them a week and a half just to get to Wales. They're in a carriage. Then they get there. Arthur's sick. He dies. He's only 15. Sickly kid anyway. There was nothing. Catherine, was there anything?
Huh?
Was there anything, Catherine?
No.
So they had Catherine swear to a papal court that the marriage between her and Arthur was never consummated at all. So it didn't happen. If it's not consummated, it didn't happen. So all they had to do was ask the Pope to annul the marriage of Catherine and Arthur. What is an annulment of a marriage?
Saying it's void.
Saying it was void, never happened. How is that different, Shion, from a divorce, which the church did not do and still does not do?
Was it because they had consummated? Is that one of those?
Well, that is the grounds that they gave for annulling the marriage, because they said it was never consummated and therefore it's void because it never happened. My question is, how is an annulment different from a divorce? It's okay if you don't know. Molly?
Like, isn't it because, like, especially modern divorces, there doesn't have to be something really big. Like, it just needs to be, like, but annulment, there has to be something big, like the marriage for the consummated, or, like, the person is, like,
That is
character
true,
or
but there's
something.
another big important difference.
The eyes of God.
What do you suppose it is, Amy?
If it was annulled, that if they were divorced, that would mean that they were still married. If it's annulled, that means that they never became like flesh with it.
Exactly. The difference is annulment says this marriage never happened. It was never a thing. Divorce says, okay, there was a marriage and now it's over. Very big difference is if you're talking about the legitimacy of any children produced in the union. So for a marriage to be annulled, you've got to have a pretty big reason that meant the people could never be married in the first place. Like, here's an example of a legit annulment reason. Let's suppose Tatum and Sol are married. Sol is a sailor, and they have 2 children together, and then Sol is a sailor, and he goes off to sea, and he never comes back, and we never hear from him again. And Tatum is like, and then, so, then Tatum goes, after like 6 years and no word from Sol, we assume that Sol is dead. And Tatum falls in love with Devon and marries Devon. And then they have 2 children. And then, 10 years later, Sol turns up again, kind of like Martin Gare did. And he's like, hey honey, I'm home. In which case, the marriage to Devon must be annulled because it could not happen because she was actually still married to Sol the whole time. She just didn't know it.
Would you not be able to annul the first marriage and say, like, that never
There's no
happened?
reason to annul the
Does
first
that
marriage.
actually happen?
He left for 6 years.
He's just doing his job.
It didn't actually happen to you. It's not real.
Just getting really emotional.
Well, anyway, back to the story. So, Ferdinand, Isabella, and Henry VII approached the Pope for an annulment for political reasons, and the Pope is very keen to grant it for political reasons, because it's all against France. And the reason they give is, well, Catherine and Arthur never did the deed. So, not consummated. The way is clear for 17-year-old Catherine to marry 10-year-old Henry. So, they wait. They wait to do this marriage. They actually wait longer than they need to, just because. Because he's 10. So they actually wait till Henry is 17.
Oh, good. So she's 20.
In the meantime, what happens to Catherine? Well, they basically give her this, like, lonely castle way out in the countryside and send her there with her Spanish ladies who came with her, and they're like, just chill here for some years. So she does. She just waits. Then,
He didn't do anything.
Yeah. It's like, hang out.
then she marries Henry. When they marry, he is 17 and she is 24.
That's not bad.
It's not too bad. So,
That's like the most.
and Henry at 17 was this really athletic, like handsome guy. So she was very pleased with it, and he was pleased with it because she's fine. So, he wasn't going to be faithful. He never was, and it wasn't expected that he would be. Kings were not; they just weren't. His father was, but that was like the exception to the rule. So, anyway, they get married, and first order of business is they need to get cracking on having babies too. And the Tudor family dynasty's claim to the throne is very loose, and Henry is the only male. So they need a son. If Henry were to die, let's go to this family tree. If Henry were to die, right now, who would get the throne?
Margaret.
Okay, but here's where it becomes more complicated. There are no more, Henry VII has no more sons. So, that means we're down to daughters, which is subpar to say the least in that day and age. And it meant it was expected that if a woman inherited the throne by some weird quirk of fate, she would marry and her husband would gain the title of king consort, and then he would really do the ruling for her. And so that might elevate another whole family that the nobles didn't like, and it was just was not good. So next in line is the oldest daughter, Margaret. Okay, well, problem. I got to use the other family tree now. This one. So see the red line here? Okay. Here is Margaret. Well, Margaret, before Henry comes to the throne, before Arthur comes to the throne, Margaret is betrothed, like any royal daughter would be, to another king of another country to cement an alliance. She is betrothed to the King of Scotland.
Oh my god. Ooh.
Yeah. Now the royal house of Scotland is called what? The
Stuart.
Stuarts. The Stuarts are basically completely tragic wherever they go. They are they're like mentally sad all the time. Honestly, there's and why wouldn't they be sad ruling this drab, rain-infested, cold, poor, beaten up, red-headed stepchild of Europe country? I have Scottish ancestry. I love Scotland. In the medieval period, you would not have wanted to live in Scotland, okay?
We wouldn't have wanted to live anywhere.
Well, but, living in France would have been pretty nice.
Not if you were a French peasant, it wouldn't have been.
No, but better than being a Scottish peasant. Way better than being a Scottish
And
peasant.
you could throw rocks and stuff.
Is that what you do for fun, Devin?
Well, anyway, Margaret marries into the Scottish royal family, and they have progeny, which become important later. But here's what's important now. When Margaret marries into the Scottish royal family, part of the treaty, the marriage treaty, is that Margaret and her children will now be barred from the English succession. Why do you suppose they did that?
Because if Henry died, then Scotland would basically have to kill
Then
his
Scotland would rule England. And they didn't want that. So they cement the marriage for a treaty, like a peace treaty with Scotland. Doesn't last very long. But Margaret is officially blocked from ever inheriting the throne, as are her children with James. Okay? So, then, back to the bigger family tree again. Or at least the one with just the writing on it. There it is. So, Arthur's dead. Henry has the throne. Margaret is blocked, as are her descendants. Little Elizabeth died at 3. That leaves who? Mary. Henry VIII had a younger sister named Mary. She has a troubled history in the family. First of all, she goes off and runs off and marries some guy that the family didn't want her to marry, the Duke of Suffolk. And that produces problems. But that marriage doesn't last too long. Eventually, they have 2 children, and they're both girls. And this oldest girl named Frances has not even been born yet. So right now, if we just focus on new King Henry marries Catherine, has no children. He has an older sister. She's blocked from the throne. He has a younger sister. She's not blocked from the throne, but she's kind of cray. So they need to get cracking having babies. So they get cracking having babies. And here's what it looks like. Okay, Henry and Catherine start with the baby making. They end up having, without going through all of them, they have, I think, 7 pregnancies over the course of something like 20 years. Of all of those pregnancies, there's only one that produces a child that lives. And that child is a girl. And they call her Mary. Among the other pregnancies, Catherine has a bunch of miscarriages. Most of those miscarriages occur at a point in the pregnancy, like second trimester miscarriages, so that it was evident that the children were male.
Ugh.
Oh no.
At one point, she does have another, like a full pregnancy, full-term pregnancy, delivers a baby boy. He only lives for a month. At another point, she has a baby boy, full-term, cord wrapped around its neck, born dead. So just like 20 years of bad luck. They have a girl. That is not sufficient. So, what happens during the 20 years of their marriage? Well, during those 20 years, Henry is not faithful. He has multiple mistresses, including one who's a very prominent mistress. It's like no pretense that it's like secret or anything. Her name is Elizabeth Blunt. She's the daughter of a noble. She's like, Henry goes on vacation with her. She sits next to him at the table when Catherine's not there. They have a son together who Henry acknowledges. Yep, he's mine.
On the cover of a magazine, like, yep, he's one.
Yeah.
Why would Henry, in this case, be particularly quick to say, yep, see that boy, that child, and that woman who I screwed? He's mine.
Not my fault.
It's not
Because
his
he
fault.
wasn't that himself.
Yes, he wants the world to know this no male child within the marriage is not my fault. This is her. It's her.
But the gender actually does come from the male.
Sorry, what?
Doesn't the gender actually come from the male? Like,
So it was his
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So he was wrong.
There were male children within the marriage, but none of them lived.
6 of them.
So, anyway, as time goes on, remember, Catherine is 7 years older than Henry. So he starts, 17, getting busy with this, and he goes through his 30s, and he's still not 37 in 15, whatever, is like closer to death than 37 now by a good measure. But he is still like vigorous. He's hale. He's hardy. He's kind of in his prime, really. And Catherine, unfortunately, has all these pregnancies, and then she goes through early menopause in her late 30s, and she just stops menstruating. Also not uncommon at a time when even wealthy women did not have a varied diet, they didn't have good nutrition, and they started their periods late and they ended them early. So she becomes infertile and they have a daughter. This is not good. Now, Henry could try to have more children within marriage, but he'd need a new wife, which would mean he'd have to get rid of Catherine. And getting rid of Catherine is not easy. Can we list all the reasons why getting rid of Catherine would not be easy?
Because her parents are Spain.
Because her parents are the King of Spain. And even though they have died by this point, she has an older sister who, granted, is insane and locked up in a cell somewhere in a castle in Spain. But that older sister has a son whose name is
Charles V.
Charles V, and he is uber powerful, like owns everything. So getting rid of Catherine, not so easy. Fraught with risk. Fraught with risk. So, but eventually, Henry's conscience starts to trouble him because he believes God is punished. This is God. This is God talking. All the dead boys. Henry was actually a very religious, kind of superstitious guy. And What does he believe the message from God is? Incest! You've been sleeping with your sister, and God is punishing you with dead sons. Wake up and smell the incest.
Excuse me?
Even though it's like the one instance where it's not actually incest.
It's like the one time they care.
So, Henry, by the time, particularly after he has affairs with many women, but there's one woman when he's in his mid-30s, and she's about 18 or 19, and she's not extremely beautiful, but she is very sexual and very crafty, and he meets her, and she is able to basically say, you want to get with that old woman and marry me. Sons, it's incest. I'm not incest. And her name is Anne Boleyn. So that starts a whole other saga. All right. Here, before you go, I have another homework assignment for you. I have an article here that I want you to read and annotate for next class. This is a rebuttal of Martin Gare, of Natalie Zeman Davis's book Martin Gare, to which we shall return next class. Everybody, grab one, annotate, bring me to next class.
And do you want our time?
Yes, find maybe like back on a desk there, pile the timelines up, make sure your name is on them.
Here, just put it on top of mine.
Sure.
Or should we file the time?
Put them
Don't get the article.
Try to put mine.